Сайн байцгаана үзэгчдээ, өнөөдрийн сэдв эхэлж байна. Өнөөдрийн зочноор Фредрих Эбертийн сангийн Аз ТV-ийн бүс нутгийн хамтын ажиллагааны салбарын захирал ноён Marc Saxer хүрэлцээрээд байна. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me.
So since you're a geopolitical analyst, I'll ask some questions concerning about the global affairs and the region. So the first question will be about Asia, since you're in charge of Asia. How do you perceive the evolving geopolitical situation landscape in Asia, especially the biggest players like China's and Japan and India's role in this region?
Well, I think it's important that we try to look at the situation from different perspectives at the same time so that we can understand the motivations of the big players, the biggest players obviously being the United States as well as China. And I think China looks at the map of Asia and it feels encircled by the United States and its allies. It feels in particular worried about the Strait of Malacca, which is a very narrow choke point off the coast of Singapore, only 16 kilometers broad. So you can interpret everything China has been doing the last 10 years as trying to break out of this encirclement westward towards Europe. That is the Belt and Road Initiative. And it has very important sidearms through Pakistan and Myanmar. So that actually helps China to circumvent the Strait of Malacca and access the Persian Gulf and actually have secure its energy supplies like that. And eastward, it pushes into the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and actually the neighbors there, Japan as well as the ASEAN countries, feel threatened by this behavior. Ultimately, I think what China tries to do is to push into the open Pacific, right? And if you look at that same actions from the perspective of Washington, they feel that this is an aggressive military peer that is pushing into the Pacific for the first time since Pearl Harbor, and therefore threatens the U.S. positions on Guam, Hawaii, and the West Coast. So it's important to understand that for both of them, the way that they look at it, this is a national security risk of the highest level, and it culminates all in the Strait of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about China, we got to talk about Taiwan, I guess, since the election's coming. Before we talk about the election, how do you see China and Taiwan's relationship in the near future, and what needs to be done to make stability in this region?
Well, most of the states around the world, including the United States and my country, Germany, recognize the One China policy. Mm-hmm. But there has been, from both sides, the US and China, certain moves in the last, let's say, 2 or 3 years that have created a situation which is less ambiguous. So there have been visits and military moves that actually made the situation way more complicated. So the big worry is that if a conflict would erupt over Taiwan, it would be very difficult to contain. Mm-hmm. And that's why the two sides, the US and China, need to talk about their red lines. And if you watched Presidents Biden and Xi in San Francisco at the sidelines of the APEC summit, that's exactly what they did. So they were talking about, this is my red line, this is your red line.
When they talk about One China policy, as you mentioned, Germany and US also recognize it, but the USA relationship with Taiwan is actually have some more impact on it, as we can see. So what do they mean that they are recognizing this One China policy? Do they mean they are supporting China or the succession of Taiwan? What is it?
Well, the U.S. position has been consistent for pretty much 50 years in this topic, and basically what they say, they will accept whatever outcome China and Taiwan negotiate as long as it's peaceful and as long as it is based on mutual consent, so basically consent of the Taiwanese people, right? Mm-hmm. So the U.S. concern is that whatever form of reunification with mainland China would be done by force, and this is where the U.S. actually draws the line.
Mm-hmm. How do you see Taiwan's elections, the results? will it have impact with its relation with China, or how do you see it, the result?
Well, I mean, first we have to see how it ends.
Yes,
but I would say it is all about these red lines. So obviously, the concern in Beijing would be that there would be a unilateral declaration of independence, and that is one of the red lines that China would not be willing to accept, right? So it will be well advised of all responsible stakeholders to not let a situation like this happen.
So then what role does this Taiwan Strait play in the broader geopolitical dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region, not just with China?
Well, like I said, this is basically where the two spheres of the two superpowers contact, let's say it that way, because so far it's relatively peaceful. But of course the concern is that this would erupt. This could be the trigger point of a larger war between two nuclear-armed superpowers, and it could quickly escalate into a regional war, drawing in the neighbors in the Asia-Pacific and with larger global implications.
So next question will be related with, of course, the ongoing war with Russia and Ukraine. As an expert or analyst, how do you see that why this war is evolved, and what are the key geopolitical factors influencing this crisis?
I think on a larger picture, you can see that this is not the only war that is erupting. We have a couple of conflicts erupting all around the world. So it seems to be an indication that the Pax Americana, basically the period of stability after the Cold War ended, is coming to an end, and we're entering a new era. We're entering a new global constellation, right? There are a couple of powers that actually want to see a different order, Russia being one of them. So what Russia did is actually it violated the letter as well as the spirit of the Charter of Paris, which was negotiated at the end of the Cold War, and is basically the security architecture of Europe. And it says very clearly that no country can violate borders in any which way, especially not by force. So that means the European security order has been upended, and we are in an open situation and have to find a way forward how we can actually reconstruct one.
Okay. So in your opinion, what are the potential consequences of the conflict for European security and stability?
Well, right now we are in an extremely unstable situation. I would assume that Putin is waiting for the result of the American election. So that means the beginning of 2025, 1 year from now, is a situation when maybe new judgments can be made. But that would mean it's quite likely that we see 1 more year of war. 1 more year.
So you mean it will continue for like 3 years?
That I don't know, but I would say if we talk again at the beginning of 2025, I would be afraid that this war is ongoing.
Another question is, in your opinion, what region is more affecting? What region this war is affecting more? Is it Asia Pacific or Europe or the alliances, EU or NATO?
Well, it is obviously a war in the middle of Europe. So, of course, Europe is directly impacted by this in a very direct way. But there's been global ripple effects, shockwaves, so to say, if you think about food security, if you think about inflation, if you think about the spike in the energy prices. That was really felt all around the world. The worry, I would assume, of the U.S. allies in the Asia-Pacific is that the U.S. is being bogged down at this part of the world, which also includes the Middle East, and will be spread thin and does not have the capacity to basically tackle one more conflict in this region.
Specifically, with the conflict ongoing, how do you foresee it affecting the alliances and partnerships among the EU and NATO?
Well, I mean, if you're sitting at the Asian side of the Eurasian table, I'm sitting at the European side, the worry is that the American security blanket is too short, right? So when the US talks about pivot to Asia, the Europeans get a bit nervous. And if the US is bogged down around the conflict in Ukraine, then the Asian allies get nervous, right? So I think that is how it impacts the dynamics. In the short run, it has certainly strengthened the unity of NATO. We see a more active NATO that we've seen for years, and it's actually growing. Sweden and Finland are joining the alliance, which actually creates quite a difficult situation for Russia in the Baltic Sea. And I would say that's the direct impact.
Mm-hmm. Sir, unfortunately, we have so many conflicts and wars going on at the moment. So I got to ask another question relating with the crisis going on in the Middle East. Considering the existing tension crisis in the Middle East, how might this ongoing crisis will influence the global balance of power?
Well, it kind of adds to the dynamic that I was already alluring to. It is one more conflict. We do not know how far it will escalate. If you see that there have been attacks on the container ships in the Red Sea by the Houthi rebels in Yemen, you can see there is a potential for this conflict to escalate beyond the Near East. And of course, the United States, as the security guarantor or the guarantor of open sea lanes in the world, will have a role to play in this conflict. But it is the second massive conflict in the world. So I think the concern in Washington is, and the concern of American allies is what happens if there is a third and a fourth conflict like this. If you think about the Balkans, if you think about the Korean Peninsula or something like that, how much capacity do you actually have? So the question that we are talking about is American overstretch.
Mm-hmm. So since you talked about the Houthis, the Yemen, how do you see the situation in the Red Sea? Will it become more broader, including other countries or just in the Middle East countries? What will happen? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, it would be quite surprising if the Houthis would be acting on their own. Of course, they also have patrons in the region. There have been a violent conflict, including its neighbors, for a couple of years. So there's always a regional dynamic, and the regional dynamic can actually escalate. I think that important players in the region seem to indicate that they do not want this kind of escalation. That's also how I read the American position for the reasons we just talked about. But this is a very unstable situation, and things happen, and that's why we cannot rule out further escalation.
Mm-hmm. Then what impact could this Middle East crisis will have on Asia, particularly in terms of energy and regional stability?
Well, it already has a massive impact on Asia. Most of the trade routes of the world go to the Suez Canal, which is now blocked. So the container ships have to go around Africa, basically, which adds a lot of time and adds a lot of cost. So that means the Asian exports are already impacted. At the same time, this is still the most important region when it comes to energy supplies. Instability there is always a risk for energy security everywhere in the world, certainly on the price level, but also when it comes to the actual supplies. So there's a couple of implications that actually go beyond the immediate security implications and enter the realm of economics.
Mm-hmm. So I think we got to end the questions with crises and confrontations. Back to the topic with Asia, since you're in charge of Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific region was the first region that economic is getting very gaining this year. We read some survey yesterday. So do you see the impact of China is playing a big role in this region, and how, since it just get out from its COVID lockdown only a year ago?
Well, I mean, China in itself has a massive impact on the region, obviously. The dynamic of the Chinese economic development is the locomotive that is pulling most of the economies in the region, including your own country, Mongolia. And that the recovery after the COVID crisis is not as good as everyone hoped it would be is a concern for the neighbors, of course. But beyond the immediate impact of what the Chinese are doing, the confrontation and the strategic competition between the US and China also creates a lot of effects. So you see a couple of geo-economic dynamics that are playing out. Both the US and China are politicizing market access, which means that you're my friend, you can come in. You're not my friend, you can go out, right? You see a weaponization of technology and technology transfer. We see a reorganization of global supply chains. The magic words here is nearshoring. So some of the production facilities could go back closer to the old industrial countries, or friendshoring, which means that the investments in production as well as infrastructure goes to those countries that are on the right side of this conflict. There is currency conflict going on over the role of the US dollar. De-dollarization is the catchword here. And so on. There's a couple of developments that, if you take them together, looking from the perspective of a developing country in Asia, there is a concern that this will negatively impact on the development model. Right? So if you look at what most Asian economies have been doing for the last 30, 40, 50 years, it is based on cheap labor, export-led growth, and catch-up industrialization. But if you actually have to compete against machines, robots, and AI, right, your comparative advantage of cheap labor will no longer be as big. If technology transfer is not happening, or you're being cut out of the global supply chains, then you cannot catch up and industrialize. And if your export markets are freezing up because there is a political entry ticket, so to say, that will actually affect your export, right? So every country in Asia right now is thinking very hard on the next development model.
From curiosity, how do you see India's developing economy? The analysts are saying that India will be very near with China in the near future, since they're very developing and the population, etc.
Well, India still has a growing population. China has not. In that sense, the Indian economy is also growing because the population is growing quite considerably. Projections show that until the middle of this century, 2050, India could grow up all the way to 1.6 billion people, which make it probably quite a bit larger than China at that point, which is shrinking. Economically, India is attracting a lot of foreign direct investment at the moment. There is a lot of infrastructure investment. So I think India at this moment is in a sweet spot. But going forward, the question then also comes, what kind of development model actually fits in this world that we've just been discussing, right? India cannot copy the development model that was successful for China, because that world of open world markets and technology transfer and so on may just not exist any longer, right? So the question is, what model will India use, and how far can this growth actually go?
Before we go to the question with Mongolia, I have another question. Since this year we're having 60 elections in the world, right? Around
80, I think, yeah.
80, wow.
Yeah.
So some experts are already saying that this year is a challenge for democracy in the world. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it's 80 elections in all parts of the world, and it's very, very, very different countries. So
Mongolia too.
Oh, the Mongolia one as well, I know. It's a very different situation. It could be a festival of democracy, but it could also show a lot of attacks on democracy. I think it's a bit difficult to say that with a broad brush, right? Most certainly, I think what it adds on top of all these conflicts that we'll be discussing is a lot of uncertainty. right? Because in quite a few countries it may be possible that the government is changing, and therefore the geopolitical orientation is shifting. So the interesting thing is, and this is why I call this a situation of strategic uncertainty, is that all the countries in the world, including Mongolia, have to make very far-reaching decisions now. But to be honest, we don't even know how the end of 2025 looks like.
Coming to Mongolia, as we all know, Mongolia is sandwiched between the two autonomic regions, things like that. But I would like to ask about a question that how the geo-economy and technology development is affecting in Mongolia. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I think we discussed this partly already. I think the development model needs to be checked and maybe adopted, because we're going into a world that I don't like the term deglobalization. I think that's not really what we're seeing. But we see a wave of protectionism around the world. We see that countries no longer let you into their markets the way it used to be, let's say 20 years ago, at the peak of the liberal globalization. So a country that is highly active in commodities exports, for instance, will have to see how that sector will develop with all its volatility that kind of imports instability also into a commodity exporting economy. And it will also be careful when it comes to the kind of issues that are in the very center of the geopolitical competition. For instance, rare earth is such an issue, right? Where increasingly the market logic is being replaced with a geopolitical logic.
So except the two neighbors, Mongolia is located in a very challenging region, as we all know, the Northeast Asia region. And another challenge this region is facing is, of course, Korean Peninsula. So how do you see North Korea's actions in this region?
Well, there have been a new series of provocations, I understand. And if you kind of connect that, and this is of course speculation now, but if you connect that to the conversation that we had over this American overstretch, I cannot help but notice that there have been a summit between Russia and North Korea in September. On paper, it was about the delivery of artillery shells and so on. But it seems to be a little bit more than a coincidence that these provocations are coming now, right? And I think it will create a situation where there's just one more conflict in the world to attend to. Does not mean that this will go all out, but it is just another hotspot of concern.
Unfortunately, we're reaching the time, so I got to ask you the last question. As you are the geopolitical analyst, how do you see, or how are you predicting this year in global security area, global security affairs?
Well, it will be another year of instability. It will be a year where the conflicts that have already started may go on one way or the other. I would not be surprised, unfortunately, if more conflicts would be added to the mix. So I think it is a year of instability and uncertainty.
And it will continue this year?
I would think so.
Sadly, I have the same opinion too. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting our invitation. We have lots to talk, but we only have 30 minutes, so it's the end of our topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Үзэгчдээ Тэнгэр телевиз өнөөдрийн сэдвт Фредерик Хербертийн сангийн Аз ТV бүс нутгийн хамтын ажиллагааны салбарын захирал Марc Saxer оролцлоо.